definitely think about this in our production app in terms of the trade-offs are around what grain of data are we storing, right? And this is more of an app question. So today the grain of data that we're storing typically and interacting with is kind of like at a monthly basis. And so once you kind of break the glass and go to daily basis data or hourly or whatever, then you really, you have enough data that, we'd have to be like partitioning or sharding at like a daily or monthly basis. It'd be way too, I don't, I can't remember how many like databases you can support in a single SQL Server instance. It's a big number, but you could definitely run into that really quickly. Anyways, the answer is we know we'll have a threshold at some point where we have a good use case for higher, or like lower grain data, and at that point, we'll have to figure out what our architecture looks like. But it really, right now, it's tightly coupled into the application architecture. So I'm taking a dependency there, and they're dealing with monthly grain, so I don't have to think about it too much.
And are you using any warehouses today outside of SQL Server? I mean, like
No,
a
not
cloud data
not like
warehouse.
not like I mean, I'm familiar. I've used Snowflake at other places and Synapse in Azure, but not today. No, there's no other data warehouse in production, unless you count unless you count some VMs running DuckDB.
Oh, we'll get into that. We'll get into DuckDB.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can't wait to get into DuckDB. But so I mean, I think this is really great to hear that not everything requires like an MDS or like a modern data stack, so to speak. I think
yeah,
that
sure.
being able to look at your architecture and say, we can save by you know doing some analytical workloads on top of our operational database and having a clear direction in terms of this is going to get us to this amount of scale and for now it
Yeah,
works.
yeah,
I
that's
mean,
right.
yeah, I mean you cut down a lot of like you don't have to do you don't have
Correct.
to pay for a warehouse, and if you don't need it, why do it, why bother
Yeah,
essentially.
sure. And there's definitely trade-offs. Obviously, when I'm bringing new analysts on board, right? And they're querying potentially against prod data, we have to be very careful in terms of setting up the guardrails, right? Um,
Let's get into that. What kind of
sure.
guardrails you have in place there?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's really more about like permissions, and there's certain parts of it that like I have that are asynchronous by default, where I'm pulling copies of large tables into kind of our analytics warehouse, so that when analysts are manipulating it, they're doing it in a safer place than just querying a prod table that might be too hot or whatever, right? Locking a prod table for a period of time. So that's kind of how it's handled today. So there's like replication happening there in that case. And then also, the other thing we're doing is we're dropping copies of tables into blob storage on a nightly basis that then you can use DuckDB to query too that are safe.
Oh, very cool. Okay. And
Yeah.
so on the first part that you mentioned, are you just relying on the database's role-based access control to
Today,
say,
yes, that's right.
okay,
Yeah, yeah. There's no magic. There's no like, oh, when you run this query, only there's no magic right now. It's just like, very much kind of controlled in a very basic way. Yeah.
and when you say replication, are you using like the shadow tables to do that? Or
No, no, it's much simpler than that.
okay,
It's just
love to hear
using
that.
part of there's a utility as part of SQL Server called BCP, which just drops tables into CSVs. So you can automate that.
I mean, data is going to end up in a CSV no matter what. So
Yeah,
that's it.
correct.
That's
So yeah, BCP is dropping that in, and then you can manipulate it with kind of separated compute, which has been really really helpful for us actually.
That's great. That's great. So you're just going all in on the tools that come with SQL Server, and based on that, enabling
Correct.
both operational and analytical use cases with it. And
Yeah,
you know,
I will push back and say that I am using DBT as well, and it's orchestrated with GitHub, which is excellent. So there's a little bit of sprinkling of MDS in there. Um, the suggestion when I started was like, hey, well, just use just use SSIS, which is SQL Server Integration Services, and I said no, absolutely not. We will not do that here. Um, yeah,
Are you going to be at the DBT Coalesce show?
No, I'm not going to be there, unfortunately, in New Orleans. I will be participating virtually this year.
Okay, great, great. Well, you can tune into my talk there as well on
Yeah,
delivering
I can't wait to
fresh
I can't
data
wait to see it.
with DBT. But the reason I brought that up is DBT does have a super strong community. They have a massive Slack channel of data
Yep.
engineers, and
Hmm.
specifically on SQL Server, right, for their SQL
Yep.
Server adapter. How has like the DBT community helped either you learn or help people on your team learn more about kind of the power features to make your team more productive?
Yeah, definitely a good question. So, I mean, I think the first thing is, obviously, they're spending their free time maintaining the adapter as DBT evolves, which is great. Um, the second thing is there's a lot of I think SQL Server, because of it's a in as much as it's kind of a excellent OLTP database, it kind of behaves in sort of strange ways at times. Um, and I think I would probably say this is probably true for almost any database. There's like 80% is ANSI SQL, and then 20% is like whatever syntax sugar or weird stuff related to how the query optimizer and query planner works, right? And so um, the community's been super helpful in figuring out those nuances, and then also helping to there's a few areas to like close gaps with some macros. And so there's some macros. For example, someone built a shim for T-SQL, or for DBT utils, so you can use DBT utils with T-SQL, which is excellent. Um, so that's been helpful. And then the community in general is super helpful for you know for there's a lot of people that come into the Slack channel who are like, look, I know that I want a cloud data warehouse, but my boss says you need to use SQL Server because that's what we use here. So like, how do I do this the right way? And I think the community really, it helps those types of people because frankly, we talk about fit for purpose, and if I squint, SQL Server's fine for analytics, but it's not like it's fine. It was fine in 2005. I don't know, and like it's a great best in class database. Like, don't get me wrong, but like you want, if you're as you scale, it's just it has issues with multi concurrency, for example, that you need to think about, and some other things that are kind of just challenges of OLTP that you don't need to think about when you're using something like a Snowflake, for example. So yeah, the community is great. They've been super helpful. I'll shout out a couple people. Derek Bish is one of them, who has been amazing in helping kind of me figure out the right way to manage specifically the ETL pieces of pulling data from one database to another with DBT. And I'm sure there's a few others. Anders, who built the adapter, is now at DBT, actually. Great folks. So
Awesome.
yeah, highly recommend join the community if you're not a part of it and you're using DBT and SQL Server. It's a very fun, good group of people.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that having community and people who are just like working on solving similar problems and being able to go chat about it in a Slack group or Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever has been like one of the nice developments that I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years with data engineering. Whereas in the past it was more the conversations were mainly controlled by the enterprises and vendors like myself.
Sure.
The but there's the other side of it, which is essentially being able to go there and share best practices and patterns. But what you're doing with SQL Server, specifically as an analytical store, even though it's not what like widely marketed as like the main
Yeah,
way to,
sure.
to use it. I mean, it does scale up to pretty high volumes and types of
Sure.
use cases. Just for instance, I work with a major logistics company, and I was really surprised when I heard that they were doing all their analytics with basically replicated SQL Server
Yep.
instances. So it's yeah, I mean it's and it just works. So if it works, but having a modern data stack with your ELT tools and cloud data warehouse
Yep.
can be very you know can also scale and help you get great performance. But ultimately, it's right tool for the job.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think and sometimes, you have to qualify that. And, I've been working with SQL Server for 7 years now, so I kind of know a lot of the nuances from an analytics perspective. Even if it wasn't, the best tool for the job, you get a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, but also, it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And, I think there's some pretty cool stuff people can do at scale. I know theoretically there's some really cool in-memory stuff with the Hackathon project that Microsoft worked on. For example, like in-memory analytical processing, but it is quite the overhead to know how to set up and configure. So everyone I've talked to has basically been like, don't do it.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think there's a few things that come up with in-memory workloads.
Yeah.
So the product I work on, Stream, is streaming SQL,
Yeah.
which is all in memory. And your comment about ANSI SQL was also kind of on the nose, because I always get the question like, oh, is it ANSI SQL? And I'm like, not really, but if you're really like striving to get ANSI SQL, I mean, even like these major products have a lot of deviations where you're gonna have to go outside
Correct.
of that. But when it comes to optimizing like in memory workloads, I think that ultimately, when you're doing things like low latency and real timey, you also have to think about the source, right? Because if you're not ingesting real time data, then your low latency queries don't really make as much sense. But what kind of data are you working with mainly?
Yeah, so Simetric is we're in the telecom industry, so we're dealing with telecom type data. So
Like
for
CDR type stuff, or
yeah, definitely, yes. And so there is, we are definitely fooling around with kind of streaming options in that regard. Yeah, it sounds like you're familiar with it. So and we are currently operating kind of one level higher than that, which is like aggregated CDRs, right? So yeah.
and is that data just, how do you ingest that into SQL Server? Is it at the application level? You have like some software that's automatically writing to it, and like that's putting
Yeah, we have our own
your IP.
proprietary software that sits
Got it.
between carrier APIs and our platform that basically does all of the JSON operations and like the horizontal scaling and all that stuff, and drops it into SQL Server.
Excellent, excellent. So I mean, it's very so that means that your data and your workloads in SQL Server are very operational. And when I say operational, it means like an engineering team is writing
Yeah,
code, and there's
yeah,
business logic, customer facing logic here, right?
yeah. That's right.
So
That's right.
you're processing transactions for customers, and then you also have you're offloading analytics. Now,
Yeah,
um,
that's right.
this is the other big debate that was actually just last week, and right now the time that we're recording this is September 14th. But there was this big debate last week about what is production data.
Oh, sure, sure.
Can data engineers ship production code? I want to get
Yeah.
your take on this.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because I'll tell you what my perspective is, which is interesting. So kind of when I started in data, like the end goal, like Tableau was like, the example everyone held up as like, this is how you do analytics. And the journey just kind of ended at the dashboard, right? So you would have a dashboard, and then someone would do something with it, right? Someone's making a decision, or they're operationalizing something, or whatever. Um, Specifically, why I actually joined Simetric was because we were going to the next step, which was you could put a number on a dashboard, but then you can set up a set of automations around it to trigger actions into carrier systems, right? So that's the part where I'm thinking about. So as you're building out that kind of functionality, that's where like the real leverage is, I think, at least in operational analytics, is like how do you light up this path from like source system all the way into your warehouse, and then to a dashboard, and then automating that action into something, so that you don't need to have a human in the loop, right? And so how do you like some of that, like some of that part, some of those pieces were very much owned by engineers, right? Like getting data from the warehouse or into the warehouse, right? And then even transforming it to some extent, depending on your structure of your company, right? Um, so the next part, though, which is very much operational, typically sits like an operations team, right? What do you do with the data once it's in a dashboard? Let's say for logistics, right? If I'm trying to line up all of my trucks to go to the right places, right, and I have a dashboard looking at it, how do I, how do I put like code on top of that? And what is, is that production code? Like, is it being written by an engineer? It's probably not. Like, right? That's where no code tools have sat. And so, I guess at Simetric, what I'm trying to, balance is like, how do we give the option of building, no code options there, but then also the ability to punch through and, see the code and modify it to get the exact thing that you're trying to do, right? And so, I think broadly what I think about is like, how do I have my team with, my operations team with operations analysts that are pretty good at SQL? How do we close the gap between, how engineering and what we're building kind of on a daily basis for our customers? It is engineering, but we don't, there's such a expert, like a level of domain expertise that I frankly, rarely would expect an engineer to have in terms of, telecom, for example. So how do you kind of bring together that domain expertise with the software engineering expertise? I don't know. We're trying to close that gap today, and it's something that we're doing on a daily basis at Simetric, is enabling operations folks to build production grade automation rules. Right?
And what's your definition of production grade?
Yeah, good question. So what I would say is like, production grade means it's tested. It means that when it fails, right, you're informed. It means that it runs consistently, and you have like observability throughout that process, right? There might be more than that, but like really what it is like, the objective from a business perspective is I can set it and forget it. And if something breaks, I get informed. It's not just like, oh, that person went on, like, here's what's not production grade, right? You have a dashboard that's built, and there's a person who looks at it every day and they take an action based on that. And then they go on vacation and the action doesn't happen for 2 weeks. Right? I can tell you that's not production grade, but that is absolutely production at like tons of companies. Right?
Exactly. And I think there's a debate over semantics that happened as well in the data engineering community, where someone said, hey, even if you have like a spreadsheet that's circulating in your company, that's production.
Sure.
Because people are using it. And
yeah.
I mean, it's a valid point, because I've definitely seen stuff from like an old draft of a spreadsheet accidentally go into like, some, external facing circles, but
the data room. Sure.
Yeah. And like, and you don't want to kind of, and I think your point about, having testing, having observability, having a QA process, I think those are all things that imply production to me, because I also have a computer science and software engineering background.
Yeah.
And, I think those are things that, if you come from that background, that's your definition of production, right? Like you mentioned. And also like, as new versions come out, like, is there backwards compatibility? I think those are some of the things that, a lot of people really consider production. But if you come from more of like just like an analytics, scripting background, let's call it that, maybe you came from a marketing or sales ops, rev ops background, and, you got pretty good with no code or low code tools, right? Then your definition of production might change.
Sure. Agree.
So how do you balance between like super, software engineering mindset of production, and then kind of like the skunk works, let's get the script going to chuck data from here to there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I kind of think about it. There's this notion kind of in the business system space that Gartner's written about called pace layered. What do they call it? Pace layered something. Pace layered systems. Anyways, the idea is that like your systems of record change very slowly, and your systems of differentiation are they change quicker, and then your systems innovations are pretty unstable, right? And so I think we can apply that same type of paradigm to what we think about production, right? Like if we're working on something that's like super innovative and super high value to customers, we can accept a softer version of production than we can for something that's like system of record level, right? And so that's kind of how I think about it. Is it a perfect parallel? No, but I think the reality is it just depends on, like, if it's table stakes, that shit better work 100% of the time. And if it's differentiating or innovative, you have a lot more leeway to experiment.
Yeah, really appreciate your insight there, and I think this is one of those things that will continue to invoke a lot of debate, but ultimately, every team should have a good internal definition of what production is, and not point to any tweets, including my own, where I said, if a CSV falls in the middle of an abandoned forest, is it in production?
Sure,
That
sure,
we'll let that question play out and see how it goes. So
sure,
I'd also love to hear about DuckDB. So
sure.
there's been a lot of talk about DuckDB. It's everything and nothing. Works great with Parquet. Super fast. It's gonna kill multiple billion-dollar companies. So let's hear about it.
I don't know
from your
about that.
perspective.
So, yeah, DuckDB at its core is a library, right? Now it happens to be a library that looks like a database. um, but what I love about it is it's the software that, like, if I mean, let me think about this way, how to frame this. If this had existed when I was in college, like, I think things would be very different for me. Like, I would have, like, this is the thing where I'm like, wow, holy shit, this is like exactly the thing that I've been missing. And what I mean by that is, like, it allows you to act on static data sets. There's lots of things it can do, but, like, let's just talk about, like, static data sets, like manipulating enormous CSVs, right? Say 100 gig in size or something. It enables you to manipulate those with local compute at crazy scale that, like, you couldn't even um, you couldn't even I couldn't even dream about doing before using something like DuckDB to handle, right? Obviously, that's not 100% true. I'm not like a Python expert. I dabble in Python, and, like, there's some pretty cool stuff with, like, pandas and data frames and things like that. And R has some really great stuff too. But I'm not kind of someone who comes from that world, right? I come from, like, accounting and finance. Like, give me Excel, like Power Query, yes. So but what DuckDB does is it bridges that gap to me between how do you handle these what I call, like, medium-sized data sets that, frankly, a few years ago would have been like big data, right? Like, I think I saw something. There's a chart circulating somewhere in some DBT or DuckDB marketing material that's I think it shows that, like, DuckDB on, like, a local machine kind of outperforms, like, a 16 node Spark cluster, for example. I think that's like the kind of on certain query, like certain loads.
Yeah, of course.
Which I think is, like, that's how much power they've accelerated onto your desktop, which is crazy. And there's a bunch of companies that are building on top of this, right? There's, like, Hex, there's
How's Hex building on top of it?
yeah, so so they're using DuckDB inside of their tool, so you can pass data between SQL and data frame and Python kind of in one notebook, in a unified notebook. Among other things that are doing, that's pretty cool. There's the Real Data folks. I don't know if you've seen that tool, which is another kind of on-premise, or you run on your local machine with DuckDB, manipulating massive data sets and kind of building analytics.
And do you, when you use DuckDB, do you typically use just CSVs, or do you use Parquet format?
Yeah, good question. Most of the time it's CSVs, because that's the world that I live in. I mean, if you're talking about CDRs in telecom, have you ever seen one of those in a Parquet? I haven't. I've definitely seen them in CSV, though, on an FTP server. So most of the time it's CSVs. Although it does support, you can one thing that's really neat, just as like a minor feature, that is really powerful is that it can query zipped CSVs, right? Both gzip and zip, whatever Z standard, I can't remember what it's called. So you can leave them at rest in those formats, and DuckDB can straight read to it, read from it, manipulate it, export, right? Which is a super powerful flow because it means that I can get 20x compression on a CSV that's 10 gigs, or let's say 100 gigs or 500 gigs. Well, now it's 10 gigs when it's compressed, and I can manipulate it and mess with it on DuckDB on my local machine. And that is super powerful workflow, right? It unlocks. You talk about IoT, you talk about edge compute. Well, with something like DuckDB, you now have all these millions of small devices that you really can't run a full-size database on. It's not necessarily true. A lot of them are running like something like SQLite, for example. But you can now run like serious analytics queries across all these tiny devices, which is super cool. I don't know if anyone's tackling that problem yet, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a really nice little tool to have in your, it seems like a little Swiss Army knife in terms of like, hey, I just have a bunch of zipped CSVs laying around. I'll
Correct.
Pull it to my, download them to my local machine and
that's right.
Run some queries on it.
And I don't have to, and like if I'm learning how to use SQL, one thing that I really like that it does too is it lights up a really, really easy path to learn how to use SQL. I don't have to install Postgres and run it locally or whatever. I can just literally, run a query in Python or in the CLI or whatever. And I don't have to worry about, running a SQL server locally, right? Like a part of how I learned was running SQL Server Express on my like local machine. That sucked. It sucked. It was horrible. I don't wish that on anybody. And like the fact that now I can just literally use like dbeaver on the CSV and write a query. I don't have to worry about installing. And as soon as I close my IDE, it frees up the memory. It goes away. Right? Those are like things like for quality of life as like a user of a computer. It's like very nice to not have to worry about. I don't have to worry about Docker. I don't have to worry about Kubernetes. I just run that shit locally. It works great.
Yeah, and I think that what you're pointing out is what we've seen in user experience being applied to developer experience, where it's like, yeah, okay, it's not like there's a really nice web user interface or mobile app, but it's like a really cool developer experience where
correct.
It gives people with coding skills like a lot of very handy shortcuts to just like do stuff super fast. So I think DuckDB is like a great example of like good developer experience being applied, and I've seen Snowflake do that as well in like some of their query semantics that make it easier for analysts to just get some stuff out of the box.
One thing I'll call out too that's super impressive about it is the testing coverage they have on it is insane. So if you actually go like check out the GitHub repo, and there's just like tests running like 24/7. Someone will like have an idea on Twitter, and like 12 hours later there's a commit on onto DuckDB, and it's in the latest build, like the next day. It's crazy. I've never seen a database that can kind of take advantage of the zeitgeist in that way, but also do it in a way that's like super reliable. And talk about production as an environment. Like their test suite is incredible, right? And they've done an awesome job of quickly innovating and in a way that's like super stable, right? Which I think is one thing that not very many people appreciate, but I certainly appreciate it. Like looking at him, like reading through some of GitHub issues, and it's like by the time I check it the next day, it's already in there. It's crazy.
Awesome. Yeah, and love that perspective as well. And one of the cool things about open source is you could just like go to the GitHub repo and see like
Sure.
how much testing they're doing, and gives that another layer of confidence.
Sure.
Jacob, I have another question for you. So Jacob Matson, you're a hardcore operator. You have a lot of in-depth technical experience in data engineering. Sure. A lot of data engineers follow you, partly because you've applied this as an operator. So the fun thing I want to ask you is, what are some of your best operator horror stories?
I mean, there's a lot, but I think I'll talk about just like some dumb ones, when I like as I was learning, hopefully so no one can repeat this.
Perfect.
So kind of in my early days of SQL Server, I was working at a company doing distribution, and create like product, full life cycle, kind of creating products and distributing them. And we owned our own distribution. And as part of that, we had an ERP running on SQL Server, Dynamics Nav. If I'm sure a few, there's a few people who are familiar with it, but it's not, one of the bigger ones. And part of what we struggled with as an organization was kind of getting analytics across our physical warehouse in terms of like what's happening next and which things to orchestrate and so on. And so that team, I was kind of leading that team, and as part of what we were trying to do was like we wanted to know when certain events were occurring in our warehouse, our physical warehouse, so that we could kind of track them. And so one thing I remember we did is we just said, okay, well, great, we're going to look at this. What we'll do is we'll look at our database and we'll just start putting triggers on when these events occur in the SQL tables. Well, the problem is they were occurring way too often, and we basically, took our ERP down for for a day because it was leaving the transactions open until the triggers completed. And then it was closing them. And they were and a lot of these transactions in ERP, the way they were structured, were atomic transactions. They weren't getting committed in bulk. And so someone would put in a sales order and it would commit each line one at a time and trigger on each one and write it into our other database. Anyways, long story short is I think it was like probably in production for like 2 hours before we had to roll that back. So yeah, that was part of my first experience using SQL Server to do analytics. Was like, oh shit, don't do it this way.
Yeah. And now I have to plug Stream because you pretty much just gave me a layup, which is being able to do change
totally.
data capture from a database, so you don't have to use triggers.
Totally.
So when you have like either a log-based change data capture or going with a change tracking type approach using the database's native CDC capabilities, then you're able to do it without adding that type of overhead. So,
yep, that's right.
but love hearing that horror story. Definitely helps me with the work I do. See, guys, don't do, and ladies and gentlemen, don't do what Jacob did. Do change data capture instead. Always use Stream for that. There we go.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's a perfect use case.
Yeah. Any other horror stories, Jacob, or do you want to jump to Q&A?
There's a bunch, but most of them are like like data migration. Those never go well. That's I'm like kind of out of the business system space a little bit at this point. Like I think because you see so many those projects are so hard. So shout out to everyone doing data migrations. Those are freaking difficult. Keep doing what you're doing. Good work.
And I do have one last question. So I know you brought up at one point in one of our offline conversations about finance use cases for streaming data.
Yeah, sure.
Would love to hear about your perspective there.
Yeah, I think in general, the kind of a lot of the unlock in analytics teams is figuring out how to partner with their finance teams, and assigning approximate values for cost or profit or whatever to specific operational items, which is really hard to do, mostly because most of the finance and accounting processes are very much batch oriented, right? And so if you want to know how much revenue is generated by this specific thing that's occurring on your e-commerce website right now, unless it's like actually like a cart purchase, very hard to do on like a real-time basis, right? And so what that means is there's an opportunity there for people to bridge the gap. I don't know, I don't have like something off the top of my head where I'm like, oh, there's a really obvious solve here. There's definitely some really interesting stuff happening, with like the blockchain and so on related to some of this stuff, microtransactions at scale, all that kind of stuff. But I guess I would just more service it as like a problem. I would say in my accounting days, one thing that I definitely emphasized was trying to figure out how to, especially like in supply chain and distribution, trying to figure out how to arm the decision makers with the right right information with the right numbers on it, and understand that there's a difference between maybe like gap financials and what we need right now to make the decisions and close that gap. It's not an easy problem, but yeah, it's definitely something I think about a lot and am passionate about, and comes into play with what we're doing at Simetric, where we're spending some time trying to apply costing at like the CDR level, for example.
Very cool. I love hearing those types of like real world use cases from a perspective of a operator and a practitioner like yourself. Um, Jacob, how about we jump to Q&A? I'll bring in some
Sure.
of the questions. So we have one question from Sriram Pasam about
Okay.
DBT. And the
Sure.
question is, what are some design level notions to keep in mind when applying complex transformations in DBT, especially in a performance and cost perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I mean, I think so my general perspective about something like using a DBT or orchestrating a pipeline in general on the data on as it relates to data is you don't need to be real time mostly. There's some use cases you definitely need to be real time, but if you're using DBT, you're probably already moving away from that. Uh, so you want to just make like you need to understand what the decision making cadence is for the business, and then make sure you align your pipeline to that. So that's the first thing that I would say about performance and cost is like if the business is making the decisions once a month, you probably don't need to run your pipeline every 15 minutes, right? Um, but maybe once a day or once a week at that point, right? But so I think that's the first thing I would say is like run it when you need it and understand when you need it, right? And like what I do in my project, I'll tell you my trick. It's not even a trick. It's just like this is what I do. So I have a GitHub. I use GitHub Actions to automate my pipeline. It's pretty simple. It's DBT only. It's one database. Like it's not like this is very simple, but it runs on a cadence, so it runs every day. And the second thing that it does is I have a little button in GitHub tied into a GitHub action that says run it right now. Right. And so I have the valve that says run this thing right now if I need it, and otherwise it runs every night. Right. And that's how I think about that specific problem. Now, think about like, generally cost and performance. It really depends. It's highly contextual on your database, right? If you're running something on like in a on-prem type database or where a VM is specifically allocated, like let's say a SQL server, I'm gonna have different advice than I will for something like a Snowflake that is, you have basically unlimited power in terms of how you run something, right? But it all goes back to what does the business need? What does your stakeholder need? Like, sometimes it's okay to have a query that runs for 4 hours, but like you have to know what the business needs to have something that runs that long, right? You have to know. So that's the first thing, right? And that's like I think it's probably a unique perspective I have a little bit because I've kind of my career started in accounting, and it was like we have a monthly dashboard. Right, we have monthly financial statements. That's when we do our check-in. So it's like you don't need to do these things every day. You just do them like once a month. And then also, because of that, also, a lot of interfacing with business stakeholders and really understanding when they need it. And so that's kind of what I would say is it starts with what do you really need and understanding it. And there's some good heuristics, I guess, but I think it's analytics is still very highly contextual on a per org basis, right? Like if there was like a piece of software that everyone could buy to apply analytics to the organization, they would do it. And the closest thing we have to that is probably like Fivetran, but even then there's always gaps. So you can't buy your way out of this problem with software today. You have to talk to people.
Awesome. Really appreciate that answer, Jacob. So, I have one more for you that, based on your experience, is a really good a question for you. So, with respect to partitioning in SQL Server,
Okay.
what would be the best way to handle unbalanced partitioning? Data is not always equally divided for each partition. MySQL doesn't even distribute rows. So, as a data engineer, what are some of the optimization methods you could apply there?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that question, to be honest with you.
That's fine.
I
Let's skip that
don't,
one.
I don't have a good answer. All I would say is that in terms of performance in SQL Server, uh, I've actually found that sharding between multiple instances of databases is more effective than partitioning at scale, right? Which adds its own sets of complications, right? Like you probably have to write, dynamically generated stored procedures, for example, to query across databases. But ultimately, it all comes down to you want to reduce latches or demand on single tables and divide that between them. And so if you can have a table for this month and a table for last month, right? Well, now you can query those independently, but you just have to figure out in your query building how how you get that to work, right? So that's my general answer to that question. I think it's probably true for MySQL, also probably true for Postgres. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, and like you said, analytics is very contextual. I know a lot of teams want to buy into the idea that I can just get like a data stack in a box or these pre-built models, and typically we see that it never works out that way because ultimately you're going to have some edge cases which really turn out to be like pretty critical from the business in terms of
Correct.
asks, and you end up customizing your workloads to make it work, which is like what we see at Stream more often than not. Like, hey, you have different business stakeholders that have different latency requirements, that have different
Yep.
modeling requirements, and it's not like one size fits all. I'm just going to set and forget this data pipeline. That's kind of nice for a data engineer to believe is reality, but then ultimately, when you're, and you would know this better than anybody else as a VP of finance, like it needs to bring value to the business for it to actually continue getting budget, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Well, Jacob, this is a really great episode. Really enjoyed having you on, and thank you to everyone who tuned in live and listens to the recording later. Jacob, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, John. Chat later.
Thanks. Bye.